This book collects most of the vampire novels from Anne Rice, at least what I would consider the primary ones. And it is a great addition. These stories have been quite influential in the horror genre, but also transformed the way vampires are actually represented in popular culture. These vampires are sensual, but also quite modern in sensibility. They can be rock stars, they can be medieval knights, they are kind of emo in a certain sense. They have quite a lot of elements from the 80s and 90s that is quite transparent. So as vampires goes, they are cooler than the classic representation. Now, whether or not that makes a great vampire is a different story. So I will explore the why of many of these stories and give you some details, so stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. Like I always have to say, doing these things really helps me out. So please go ahead and do them. It will increase the visibility of the channel. And if you like what I do here, doing this really will assist me. Also, check out my X account, I'll put it on the bottom, and my Ko-Fi, where you can donate recurringly or a single tip. And you can also check out my merch store to help me promote the channel. And thank you again. In this episode, I'm going over The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. And this edition is from Alfred Knopf Publishing from around 2000. Now this edition, you can find it easily in most places. Quality-wise is good because it collects all these novels. It doesn't have a long introduction. It just has the story straight up. Like I've mentioned before in these editions, the only negative of the quality is that when you handle the book, it starts erasing a lot of the ink that was on that cover. So it's almost like they were not meant to be read. Because every time I have one of these editions that you find basically on the collector section in Barnes & Noble, you will notice that if you read them, grab them a lot, etc., it will start discoloring. So that's a bummer, but again, it is what it is. You don't have to go with this edition. You can go with any edition you find. Trust me, there's plenty of them online. Now, these novels are indeed very intelligent when it comes to world building and character development. Rice has always been excellent at that particular skill. So what is a vampire to her? That to me is the most interesting aspect of her work, because the idea that a vampire is primarily a frustrated, sensible person who desires to fit in, to be part of society, who now has to contend with living way longer than it's normal, isolated against his own will, contains a lot of the classic existential concerns that manifested especially in the 80s and 90s. So her vampires are quite time-bound, ironically speaking, because it reflects a particular point of view from a particular time. A lot of people forget that when we read books or consume music in a particular era, those that are producing it are not from our era. If I grew up listening to music from the 80s, for example, in the 90s, the people making that music are not from the 80s and 90s. They're from the 60s and 70s, and some even from the 50s. So their consciousness, it's really in a different time period. Just like today, the people really making a lot of the influential decisions are from a generation that grew up in the 80s and 90s. And therefore, you're living that effect. Now, the reason that is interesting to me is because for the vampire, he steps beyond eras. These people are from way in the past, but they seem to constantly reflect the current period. So they are a product of the 80s and 90s, culturally speaking, even though they are supposed to be from a different era. My point is just the time issue there, the consciousness of generational trauma is fascinating. And these vampires reflect that sensibility, which I think if she would have written that story now, I think those vampires would look very differently. And I don't think for the better. Now, I'll do a slight overview of these stories just for the sake of consistency with the collection. I always try my best not to spoil. I just go over what I think are basic themes. The first one is Interview with the Vampire, and this is obviously a classic, not only because of the movie, but the book itself was actually very popular, a bestseller. And this is actually one of the first English language novels I read in my life. I read it as a kid. And it definitely created an impression on me. And the reason I think is because, again, the exploration of time, because of the way it's structured. It starts with an interview, but the interviewee is really doing primarily a reflection on his life. Almost a visit with a psychiatrist, because there's a lot of emotional analysis by this vampire about his life, his birth as a vampire, etc. And because the primary dynamic in this book is about personal relationships, I think it carries through as an excellent work with vampires as a side topic. When you read it, it doesn't seem to be really about vampires per se. It's pretty clear it's about everything else around it. And let me provide a pretty cool quote from this story. Both were moral decisions. Both served a higher good in the mind of the artist. The conflict lies between the morals of the artist and the morals of society, not between aesthetics and morality. But often this isn't understood, and here comes the waste, the tragedy. An artist stealing paints from a store, for example, imagines himself to have made an inevitable but immoral decision, and then he sees himself as falling from grace. What follows is despair and petty irresponsibility, as if morality were a great glass world which can be utterly shattered by one act. But this was not my great concern then. I did not know these things then. I believed I killed animals for aesthetic reasons only, and I hedged against the great moral question of whether or not by my very nature I was damned. And that is such a great philosophical quote. And like I said, existential. What is my true nature? The Ontology of a Vampire. I would have loved that title, because that's really what's in play here. What happens to a human being when they become more predatory but also immortal? What are the consequences? What is morality? And these characters tackle this in a very direct fashion. Can you be damned by nature but still be moral? And it's a very Catholic theme for sure. And you can tell because of the author's background that this is where this notion is coming from. Now, all of these novels are highly religious. Its tone and focus, even if it's critical, the vampire being somewhat the source of the antinomian edge to the novel. They're still basically frustrated Catholics. They seem to hold a view of the universe that carries the weight of original sin, of redemption, of confession, of the nature of sin itself, and how that combines with moral law. These are all classic Catholic concerns. Now, the next story in the Chronicles is the Vampire Lestat, and we now enter into the more pop culture aspect of the vampire, the rock star, and now we get the perspective of Lestat, quite different from the melancholic Louis in Interview. And I did like this novel, but only when it goes into the history of Lestat itself. In other words, I don't like the rock star, kind of poppy element in the beginning or the end of the novel. I really primarily like the heart of the novel, which is most of it. But when I started reading it, I was so disappointed with the novel because I thought it was going to continue going that way, and I thought it was going to be terrible. I just find it very cheesy and unlikable. But once it enters into the past, into a reflection of its history, then it becomes a spectacular book. So it's kind of a problem for this reason, because if you don't survive the beginning of it, you'll never realize that the center of it is really good. Let me provide a quote from this particular novel. Do you realize that? We'll never know why the hell any of it happened, not even when it's over, I shouted at Nicholas, who was sitting back on the bed, nodding and drinking his wine out of a flagon. We're going to die and not even know. We'll never know. And all this meaninglessness will just go on and on and on. And we won't any longer be witnesses to it. We won't have even that little bit of power to give meaning to it in our minds. We'll just be gone, dead, 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 without ever knowing. And obviously that's quite a normal concern, the fear of finishing your life without really knowing what was the meaning of it, its purpose. Now, like I said, right in the heart of the novel, it actually explores mythology. And it's beautifully done because it goes through a lot of different myths to kind of connect them with the vampire lore. So it does a really good job weaving that in. And it has complexity. And I think it is indeed the most sophisticated of all the novels in this collection, especially because the Egyptian angle impressed me the most, because it actually made me think of Vaishnavism in India. Without giving too much, there's a part of the novel in which you have a form of deity worship of statues that are actually alive. And seeing this in a novel was quite impressive to me. And I'm not really sure that the author was aware of this connection. It could be something that she thought would be creative and interesting without realizing that all she was doing was placing there the way deity worship was done, not only in India today, but also in the ancient world in Egypt itself and in many other cultures. The notion of seeing the icon or the statue of a god as a living, breathing entity. Vaishnavas, for example, in India, they put their statues to sleep and they wake them up in the morning and they dress them and they feed them, etc. And if you go way back in the past in Egypt with deity worship, it was basically the same. If you go to Spain, you see a lot of the statues of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. They have actual dresses on them, and they treat them in a way that assumes their living reality. That's why they cry or they bleed. There is a connection between the living and the dead, the statue and its representation, that is quite powerful. Now, finally, we get to the Queen of the Damned. Conceptually, it is great because it has a lot of background history of vampires themselves, so that dynamic continues. And here's a quote. "We live in a world of accidents finally, in which only aesthetic principles have a consistency of which we can be sure. Right and wrong we will struggle with forever, striving to create and maintain an ethical balance. But the shimmer of summer rain under the street lamps, or the great flashing glare of artillery against the night sky, such brutal beauty is beyond dispute." This novel indeed has a lot of feminine flair for sure. It carries that matriarchal dynamic. Of course, the Queen of the Damned is a very powerful entity, the mother of all mothers. There's a mythological concept here that is being presented that I think is quite clever as well. And here's a final quote. "Behold, earth-shaking inventions which are useless or obsolete within the same century, the steamboat, the railroad. Yet, do you know what these meant after 6,000 years of galley slaves and men on horseback? And now the dance hall girls buy a chemical to kill the seed of her lovers, and lives to be 75 in a room full of gadgets which cool the air and veritably eat dust. And yet for all the costume movies and the paperback history thrown at you in every drugstore, the public has no accurate memory of anything. Every social problem is observed in relation to norms which in fact never existed. People fancy themselves deprived of luxuries and peace and quiet, which in fact were never common to any people anywhere at all." That's a cool little critique of the modern world right there, coming from a vampire. To be honest, I really didn't like this novel, and it is the reason I do not intend to continue with the whole series. There are a couple more novels after this, and I just don't feel a lot of inclination to go that route because of this novel. I love the allegorical connection to the Virgin Mary that is made. All these things are very cool, but really, by the time I got to this novel, it just lost a lot of what made the original ones great. How far can you take this kind of stuff? Difficult to say. If you think I should continue because it is worth it, you can drop it in the comments, but I have a feel that beyond this volume, I would be truly wasting my time. Because Anne Rice does great stuff, and I read many of her other novels, and I like them. But I don't think there's a lot more to say about Lestat that would be truly profound. So I think I should leave it here. So great work if you focus on the psychological and the existential. And I think it changes the cultural way that we see vampires permanently. And almost every film that has come after these novels has been in the mood of Anne Rice's interpretation of a vampire. So a very powerful testament to her work for sure. Hopefully you enjoy this review. Please remember, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.